Greetings, hello, welcome, willkommen. It is I, it is me, it is alfsvoid. So today we are diving into our second session in the philosophy of mind. If you haven't seen the first session, you should go and watch that. But you'll survive this, so it'll be fine. It's all new information. Today our topic is substance dualism. So most people in the world, as most people in the world are religious, to my understanding, most people in the world are therefore substance dualists. And that is to say, what is substance dualism? It is essentially the view that the mind and the body are different substances, or different things. That is, that the mental is something over and above the physical. It is not reducible to the physical. And this is essentially the idea of the soul, the immaterial soul that can live without the body. So these are the views that we're going to be going through today, the arguments for substance dualism and the critiques of them. However, notably, we will stay away from any religious arguments, any sort of soul-based religious arguments, as most philosophers tend to veer away from these things for the reason that in making any kind of religious argument, you end up having to prove the existence of God, which we all should know cannot be logically proven or empirically proven. Unfortunately. No offense to the religious, but that's not what we're about here. But we will touch on it. We will examine some God problems at the end. Our outline for the day then is we will be looking at Leibniz law, so arguments for substance dualism based on Leibniz law, and we will be exploring explanatory gap arguments as well as modal arguments or modality. And then we will conclude with the problem of interaction between mind and body for substance dualists. And therein we will see some religiosity. We'll see how two philosophers in particular decided to try and work God in to try and solve the problem of interaction between the mental and the physical. So without further ado, let's dive right in. So Leibniz law, or otherwise known as the indiscernibility of identicals, but I think it's probably better to just call it Leibniz law, is essentially the argument form that if x and y are the same entity, then x and y must share all properties the same in order to be identical. Or in other words, if one has a property, say x has a property that y lacks, or vice versa, then x and y cannot be the same entity. They must therefore be distinct entities. So plugging substance dualism into that argument form, we get the argument, premise 1, if the mind and the body are the same entity, then they must share all the same properties. Premise 2, the mind and the body do not share all the same properties. Therefore, conclusion, the mind and the body are distinct entities. What do you think about that? Are we convinced? Are we convinced? Well, you might be thinking, okay, well, what are these properties? What are these properties? That's probably, we need some support more than just saying they don't have all the same properties. What properties? What properties does the mind have that the body doesn't, that therefore make them distinct entities? Have no fear. We're about to go through 5 ways that philosophers believe that the mind and the body are distinct, or that how the mind varies from the physical. Number 1, minds and physical entities are distinct in spatiality. So for example, Descartes, a ye olden time philosopher, liked to make the argument that bodies have specific spatial parts and spatial locations, whereas minds are immaterial. So that is to say, form an idea of the Eiffel Tower. So the Eiffel Tower itself has a spatial location. It is itself a spatial object. We can imagine cutting it in half. We know where it is in time and space. However, when it comes to the mind, my idea of the Eiffel Tower, where in my brain is the idea of the Eiffel Tower? And moreover, how in my brain could we cut in half, perhaps, my idea of the Eiffel Tower? That is, how could we subject the mental to the same criteria of which we judge the physical? Or how can we judge mental bodies, if you want to call them that, in the way that we, or mental ideas as bodies, in the way that we judge physical bodies in the world? Descartes says we cannot, so therefore we have a soul. Next reason. Number 2, So another way that minds are distinct from bodies is in the sense that only minds can have rational thought. So far as we know, the lights blinding me in front of me are not having conscious thoughts about the degree to which I am squinting. Just a thought. Just something that seems like a different property. Or the walls, for example. Other objects around me that are physical bodies, do not seem to have the same capabilities or capacities of which I, a privileged mind, have. Okay? So number 3, only things with minds are capable of intentionality and aboutness. So that is to say, this sort of ties into rational thought, but as you recall from, hopefully you remember from our session 1, about the problem of intentionality or the problem of aboutness, which is to say that I, as a mind, not only am I rational and I can think about things, but also I can contemplate things that exist outside of time and space, right? I can picture myself on the moon. I can picture myself being sucked into a black hole, possibly. I'm not really sure what happened once I was in there, but I can imagine being sucked into it. I can have a whole idea about all kinds of things that may never exist, don't exist. I can think about myself in relation to anything I so desire. And so far as we know, these physical bodies out here aren't necessarily having all these wild thoughts and dreams of being sucked into black holes. So I'm not sure what that says about my consciousness, psychologically, that's my first idea, but let's continue. So way number 4. So another thing from our first session here is that only minds can have qualia, or phenomenal, i.e. derived from phenomenological, properties or qualities. So that is to say, I, as a conscious, phenomenal being, can taste the tang of a lemon. And is tang the product of the lemon itself, or is tang the product of my relation and tasting of the lemon? That is to say, if a lemon were to stand alone, would the lemon in itself be tangy? Or can the lemon only be tangy in relation to something which tastes it and therefore determines it to be tangy? That's your daily, that's it, we're done. That's all the philosophy we need. I'm just kidding. Or emotion, for example. There are all kinds of these things, these strange qualities and habits of mind that minds seem to have, but which physical bodies do not seem to have, right? Okay, so our last one, number 5 here. So another difference between minds and physical bodies is how they are known, right? So I can be, as we discussed in our first session, I can be deceived by the existence of material bodies, right? So I could have hallucinations. I could be a brain in a vat somewhere. I could be, we could be in the Matrix. I have no way to not disprove any of these things. However, so yes, I cannot be certain about physical bodies. But in my uncertainty, the one thing that I can be certain of is that I, in some capacity, exist, right? So I know myself because I am the one thinking myself. Unless this is some sort of other philosophical problem that's just like even beyond our own comprehension currently. But for the time being, I know myself in a way that I cannot know material bodies. So this is, again, a distinguishing feature or property between the physical and the mental. Okay, so are you convinced at this far? What do you think? What do you think? So let's make an argument out of this last one. So let's make a Leibniz law argument based on the last example we set about our knowledge, the difference of knowledge between how we know ourselves and how we know physical bodies. So, premise 1. I know with absolute certainty that my mind exists. Premise 2. I don't know with absolute certainty that any physical thing exists. Premise 3. By Leibniz law, if my mind has a property that no physical thing has, then my mind is not identical to any physical thing. Conclusion. Therefore, my mind is not identical to any physical thing, and we have souls, and that's the end of this whole video. What do you think? Is this a good argument? Is it? Well, not so fast, bucko. let's consider something that this argument is actually guilty of, called the intentional fallacy, with an S and not a T. So consider this argument form. Premise 1. Lois Lane believes that Superman has the property of being bulletproof. Premise 2. Clark Kent does not have the property of being believed to be bulletproof by Lois Lane. Premise 3. If Superman has a property that Clark Kent lacks, then, by Leibniz law, the two are distinct entities. Conclusion. Therefore, Superman and Clark Kent are in fact distinct entities. Right? So what's wrong with this argument form? What's wrong with this? Can you guess? Take a stab at what the intentional fallacy might be? Don't worry, I'm gonna tell you. So the intentional fallacy is essentially that just because you believe X to be a property of Y, that doesn't necessarily mean, independent of you, that X is or is not a property of Y. There could be something you don't know. Like, you may think you have absolute certainty, but that doesn't mean beyond your subjective being, you in fact have objective certainty about what you think you do. And this is meant to be shown through the case of Lois Lane's thoughts about Clark Kent versus Superman. So despite her belief that Clark Kent isn't bulletproof in the way that Superman is, that's because she doesn't know that Clark Kent is in fact Superman, right? There's a piece of knowledge she has that's fundamentally missing, which flaws her perception and therefore her arguments and ideas. So we can also be subject to this, and it is for this reason that particular Leibniz law argument fails. So what do you think? Can you make a different Leibniz law argument? Is there anyone out there who thinks from the properties that we discussed that you could make a sound argument by Leibniz? So moving on, let's now move into explanatory gap arguments for substance dualism. So essentially, an explanatory gap argument is a kind of argument that'll take some aspect of the mind that's not currently explained by physical substances, and then conclude that because this aspect of mind is not explained by physical substances, therefore the mind must be its own substance, right? So let's explore. So one example of this kind of argument for substance dualism comes from Descartes. So Descartes once argued that on the basis of human language, he said, machines, no matter if they can replicate human sounds to sound like human beings, no matter what, a machine will never be able to fool a human being into believing that it is as intelligent as a human being. So because this can never be done in his mind, because nothing will ever be able to replicate what it is to be human physically, therefore, the mind is something all of its own accord. It's independent substance. We have a soul. Okay, so not so fast, Descartes. So if Descartes had lived to present day, he probably, that is, if he had lived to present day and actually seen what kind of artificial intelligence we have going on now and what that might be like only like 100 years from now, perhaps Descartes would have had a different idea and wouldn't have been so quick to jump from, well, we don't have the knowledge now, so we'll never have it, right? So another example of an explanatory gap argument, which is my personal favorite, comes from Leibniz. It's a thought experiment in which Leibniz imagines himself shrunken down to a very minuscule little being, and he enters the ear, goes into the human brain, and he's looking around in there, and he's like, yep, no signs of anything that looks like consciousness. No, just lobes, structures, things that are not clearly ideas. Therefore, the mental is not the physical. Okay, so what do y'all think about, how about them apples? How about that? Not so fast, Leibniz and Descartes. I see what you're doing and roll it on back there, boys. So explanatory gap arguments, as you may have deduced, are highly fallacious. Why? Because they rely on assumptions. Namely, they presuppose that that body of information that we currently lack, we will never have it. We'll never have it. There's never going to be an answer. So therefore, because there's currently no necessarily perfect physical explanation for how the mental could be physical, therefore we will never have set information for how the mental is in fact physical, and therefore the mental is something over and above the physical, and we have souls, right? How about them apples? How about that reasoning? So obviously there's what's wrong with this, if you didn't get it from my sarcasm there, is take, for example, the nature of life, right? Like how life evolves on Earth. Even if you're religious, there are some religious people, to my understanding, who agree with Darwin's theories, who accept evolution. Of course, there's some that don't. But point, before Darwin, life was goddamn mystery. Ain't nobody have any idea what we're all doing here, right? That's why we have all these myths and ideas about postulating our existence. No idea. But there was a time when people, the point here is that there's a time when people just never thought we would know. It was just a complete mystery. But then as time progresses, as humans evolve, as we, branch out, develop technology, we tend to acquire more answers to things. More ingenuity means more answers. So, similar, DNA, right? The discovery of DNA and how that works. Wow, we finally have some answers for things. Never thought we'd have those. So imagine if, all of human civilization just gave up. They're like, for everything we don't have an answer for now, let's just throw in the towel. We'll never know. Let's just go with what our intuition says. Modal arguments. Modality. So philosophers are very fancy, and instead of just saying conceivability and possibility, they like to refer to or call these things modality. So modal arguments for substance dualism therefore hinge on the ideas that because something is conceivable, it is therefore possible. Let's look at a modal argument, shall we? So, premise number 1, I can form an idea of my mind existing without any physical thing existing. Premise 2, whatever I can form an idea of happening is something that could possibly happen. Premise 3, if it is possible for one thing to exist apart from another, then they cannot be one and the same thing, but must be two distinct things. Conclusion, therefore, my mind is something distinct from any physical body, from any physical thing. So, again, not so fast here, people. Jeez Louise. So modal arguments, right, as we were saying, they hinge on this movement from because something's conceivable, that makes it, in fact, possible in the world. Right? So, however, what justifies this jump from because something is conceivable, it is therefore possible? In truth, the jump is really an assumption, right? Just because I can conceive of something happening doesn't mean it's necessarily possible. So, for example, I could conceive of a unicorn showing up in my room tomorrow morning and just being my noble steed for the rest of my days. But is that really possible? I mean, could there be some sort of interdimensional clash, like Fringe style, where another reality merges with ours and all of a sudden I wake up and there is in fact a unicorn from another dimension in my room with me that will therefore be my noble steed for the rest of my days? I mean, maybe. I sincerely doubt it. That's a pretty big leap. That's a leap of faith if I ever heard one. So, long story short here, modal arguments, they're just speculative, complete assumptive, speculative arguments. They're not trusted modes of argumentation. Alright, so we've discussed at this point, what have we discussed? We discussed Leibniz, we've discussed explanatory gap, and we've discussed modality. So now, besides all of the other problems that we've discussed along the way with each of those argument styles, there's also one more big problem for every single possible substance dualism argument, and that is the problem of mind-body interaction. Don't worry, it's a problem for everything we'll discuss in this series. So essentially, if minds if the mental is a distinct substance from the physical substances, two different spheres of substance, then how does interaction between these two things take place? How do they causally affect one another, right? So what processes allow this to happen? How is there causality between two fundamentally different kinds of substances, right? Because when we observe things in the world, for example, like picture one pool ball hitting another pool ball, right? In order for that second pool ball to move, it first needs to receive the knocking force of the first ball, right? And this is essentially the case for all processes that we can see or examine. There is some physical reason for them. Even the ones we can't see, like magneticism, for example, there is still underlying that a physical process occurring. So, fear not, some religion is coming in to give us the answers that we so need and so desire. So I'm not so sure, Mellenbrache, fuck, I said it the same twice. So I'm just gonna say Mellenbrach, because that's how it's gonna be. One philosopher, Mellenbrach, he created something called occasionalism to try to solve this mind-body problem in order for us to have souls or for the mental to be separate from the physical. So his idea was that God intervenes at every causal occurrence, at every action and reaction. God is there continually intervening in creation in order to make sure that if I want to move my hand out right now, it moves. If I were to stub my toe, I feel pain. Is it plausible? Well, not so fast, Mellenbrache. Not only does this view, of course, as we discussed at the beginning of the session, not only do any views which bring in God have to then justify bringing God into the picture to begin with, so if God were to intervene to execute the physical consequences of mental decisions, then, like at every step for everybody in the world, anybody's ever existed, then God is necessarily a moral accomplice to any immoral or evil action done in the world. It's God's hand in there, doing all the horrible things that need not be named in the world. So that is not very godly, is it? I mean, Descartes once speculated that perhaps the true God is an evil demon deceiving you about everything. So, maybe we've got it all wrong. Maybe we're but a science experiment. Huh? How's that for God? So, another solution using God. Good old Leibniz. Leibniz developed something called parallelism. So essentially, his idea was not that God intervenes at every step in creation, but rather, at the beginning of creation, God created two independent spheres or streams. So there's the mental and the physical, and both of these streams are a predetermined, pre-established harmony. That is to say, all of our reality and existence between and within these two streams is predetermined by God. And that is how, when I move my hand, it moves, and I make a decision, the consequences come about in the world. It is because I'm merely playing out a script written by God. For what reason, I don't know. Perhaps to keep him company in the loneliness of eternity. I don't know. So, again, are you sure about that, Leibniz? So, problems with this. First, of course, it requires proving God exists. This is a mere myth. I mean, how do you prove first that? But second, with this view, the problem is that if God exists and did this, then essentially we have no free will. Free will I mean, as much as we already think free will might not exist, it definitely doesn't exist now. That's it. Nobody's morally responsible for anything they do. It's just a predetermined plan. So you might as well just, go live your darkest desires. That's all there is to it. Okie dokie, so that concludes our discussion, our session for this week on substance dualism. So, were you convinced? Do you think we have a soul? Do you think maybe we don't have necessarily a religious soul, but the mental is in fact something different and over and above the physical? Do you think any of these arguments were good? Do you think any of them can be saved? Can you form one of your own? There's lots of questions. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section, and I will see you next week. And next week we'll be talking about property dualism. So don't worry, we're gonna get to physicalism, materialism, panpsychism. We're gonna get to all of the isms and schisms. But next week we'll be doing property dualism, which is the view that the mind and the body, the mental and the physical are the same, but they have different properties. So just fuck Leibniz law. That's just not a thing anymore. So we're just moving forward. Okay, see you next week.